Well, hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to go over our readings and give them some context. We have some really neat readings this week. You'll notice that I changed the categories from assigned and extra to basic and expanded. I know that some of you are able to do more or less as you have time, and so I thought that better explained what we were going for. Our first reading is the Siddur Guide, Integrating Liturgical and Spontaneous Prayer. During my days in rabbinical school at MJTI, I took a class on Jewish prayer on the themes of the service. It was taught by Rabbi Stuart Dowerman, and I found the way that he outlined the themes of the service really helpful for me. So my final project that I put together, was a pamphlet intended to help people who did not grow up with the Jewish service or with a liturgical tradition to better enter into the prayers. Really, I did this project to help myself draw more life from the service. So this pamphlet is that project from 2009, and I hope that it will be helpful to you as well. I recommend reading through the first half. The pages are listed in the packet there, and then we'll be using this pamphlet for some of our prayer activities in the Messianic Jewish Lab. As we continue growing in our morning prayer time, we'll be jumping into the first chapter of Mike Evans' book, Why Not Waste Time with God? Last unit, we just read the introduction. The great news is that we just received a box of these books, and so we want to give them to you as gifts. So those of you who have been at Ruach should already have gotten a copy, and Shayna took some time last week to mail them out to the rest of you. So you should be getting those soon if you haven't already, and let me know if you don't get one, and also say a thank you to Shayna if you get a chance. Mike is a close mentor of mine, and this book reads very simply. It has a lot of great nuggets and quotes. The first time I read through this book, I read it devotionally. It took me a year, and I just read small sections every few days or so. And so this book works really nicely to do that if you want to break it up and break up the chapter over the course of the unit. Mike wrote this book before we had met, and I was the first Messianic Jew, actually, that he had really come into contact with. Since then, Mike has developed a real heart for the Messianic Jewish movement, and there's one section in this chapter on doing where Messianic Jews are not really in mind, and I just wanted to frame it for us a little bit here. He's making a terrific point, but we might just frame it slightly differently in a Messianic Jewish context. Mike's point here is that while following God's life and his Torah is important, it isn't the best to feel a sense of urgency to do these things in order to win his love or to prove yourself to him or others, because he already loves you and is already pleased with you. Mike is helping us to see that we need to have spiritual disciplines in our lives that help us to internalize and rest in the great love and intimacy that God already has for us, to begin to see ourselves more as he sees us before we can appropriately live these things out. So for us Jews, Jewish life is not something we do in order to earn a higher standing with God. A Jewish life in Yeshua is a response to his great love and his faithfulness, like taking his hand and letting him lead us into his life and into his purposes. I once had someone at a conference where I was presenting at ask this question. He said, you say that God loves you no matter what you do. That was one of the themes we were covering. And she said, but aren't we supposed to strive to please him? Don't we have to work hard to belong? I had an answer that kind of came to me that's really stuck with me, actually, for a while. I said, imagine you had, a 3 or 4-year-old daughter, and she was sitting on the steps, with her eyes down, looking sad, and you came out to cuddle up next to her and asked her what's wrong. And she says that, she feels that when she messes up, she feels like she no longer belongs to her family and shouldn't live here anymore. What would you say to her? You need to just strive harder, do more, you need to shape up or else you'll be on the street, No, of course not. Your heart breaks for her. And you say, no, you belong to me no matter what. Nothing you will ever do will ever make me stop loving you. I love you even when you mess up. You always belong. And so it's the same with God and you. You don't need to strive to belong. You already do. And then he can take your hand and he can lead you to where you need to go, and he can help you to do the things that you need to do. Our next book, The Jewish Gospels by Daniel Bayorin, we'll be reading the introduction here. And Daniel Bayorin considers himself a liberal Orthodox Jew. He's the professor of Talmud at Berkeley in California, and most of Bayorin's books are actually quite dense, but this is a unique little book written to the regular person on a remarkable topic for an Orthodox Jewish scholar, even a liberal one. Today, most Jews and Christians acknowledge that Yeshua was Jewish. That's new in our century, but it's become common knowledge today. Everything about Yeshua is thoroughly Jewish, except for one area. Many modern Jews have drawn the line when it comes to a divine human figure. Daniel Bayorin crosses that line, arguing as the main thesis in his book that the concept of a divine Messiah figure is entirely rooted in Second Temple Judaism. Though Bayorin does not consider himself a Messianic Jew, he lays important foundations for the Messianic Jewish movement. Even our claim to a divine Messiah is thoroughly Jewish, removing one more major obstacle that many Jews have that keeps many of our people from taking a serious look at Yeshua, the Jew. Bayorin points out that now the new question for Jews is not whether Jews believe in a divine Messiah, but rather, is Yeshua in fact this divine Messiah? We actually invited Bayorin to give a lecture at Ruach Israel in 2012, and he came to do an evening lecture here in our sanctuary. The room was packed. Some of you may have been there. Bayorin opened his lecture by stating that there was no reason why the wider Jewish community today should not view the modern Messianic Jewish movement as part of the Jewish community. Now, we would not agree with everything in his book. Bayorin, in his own admission during his lecture, has stopped short of recontextualizing Paul in Jewish context, though one of his students, Pamela Eisenbaum, has written a book on it with the provocative title, Paul Was Not a Christian. Now, of course, she does not mean that he wasn't a follower of Yeshua. Her basic premise is that Paul continued to live as an observant Jew his entire life, and that his encounter with Yeshua was not a conversion out of Judaism, but an awakening within it. This is coming up later in our class. In the introduction, Bayorin makes a distinction between Jesus and the Christ. What he means is more academic associations with Jesus as the person versus Christ as the Redeemer, the divine Redeemer. Yet, of course, in our circles, we use Yeshua and Messiah, but this is not yet the case in the world of academia. Bayorin uses the conventions of Jewish and Christian, though at the time of his book, he was familiar with the beginnings of the Messianic Jewish movement. He uses the term Christian Jew as a broad term to try to understand those who are Jewish and believe in Yeshua. We like the term Messianic Jew in order to indicate that we are part of a wider Jewish world and live within a wider Jewish community. A Christian Jew might be a term for someone who is Jewish but lives primarily within a non-Jewish Christian communal context, if you will. Anyway, the introduction here is a charming review of his basic premise in the book. In our expanded section here, I have the first chapter in Bayorin's book. In this chapter, he opens up this thesis, which he just shares in his introduction. So if you're interested in going a little bit deeper and unpacking what he actually says, this is the chapter to read. Bayorin makes some terrific points in this chapter. I'll also mention that he slips in some other ideas, such as the evolution of Canaanite mythology of the El-like sky god of justice and the younger rider on pages 45 and 46. So I wanted to frame this actually with C.S. Lewis's writings about mythology. For Lewis, mythology doesn't mean fiction. It just means a story that is important to the life of a people in a community over time. A myth can be more or less true, more or less historical, or more or less fictional. C.S. Lewis calls the story of God and his son Yeshua the true myth. The idea that God sent his son to become a human and to die for our sins is not a fabrication built on the shoulders of previous mythologies. Instead, this is the true story that is so fundamentally built into the fabric of humanity that we should expect cultures of all time, before and after, to muse and to develop these concepts on their own terms. So the fact that different cultures developed similar stories simply demonstrates that God's intentions were in the air. They are a part of our shared human experience. Remember, the scriptures say that Yeshua was coming, that his coming was planned since the foundations of the earth were laid. So we should expect them to be built into the fabric of other cultures around the world. Bjorn's big point is critical for us Messianic Jews. In the first century, Jews were waiting for a divine human Messiah called the Son of Man. We'll pick up more with Bjorn's book when we cover Shabbat and Kashrut later in our course. Next in our expanded section here, we have Finding Our Way Through Nicaea. This is a paper by Rabbi Mark Kinzer. And in Bjorn's introduction, he mentions the Council of Nicaea, where the historic Roman Church under Constantine crafted several critical statements reflecting the divinity of the Messiah. These creeds, the Nicene creeds, are controversial in the Messianic Jewish movement. And so I've included an article by Rabbi Mark Kinzer called Finding Our Way Through Nicaea that I think is terrific. So if this is an area of interest to you, definitely worth the read. Basically, in a nutshell, Rabbi Mark takes us through the Nicene Creed, and he argues that in the bare bones, we Messianic Jews can affirm the Nicene Creed. However, we must reframe its supersessionistic and anti-Jewish contours. So if that's interesting to you, take a look at his article. Lastly, we're going back to the body of faith, Michael Visegrad's book that we sampled last unit. And I included this because our discussion on the sacrifices this unit, Visegrad engages a brilliant discussion on the reasons for animal sacrifice and on how prayer and deeds have become its replacement. And this leads to Abraham's almost sacrificed son Isaac, the sacrifice of the martyrs. And though he doesn't go here, I think it points us toward Yeshua, who is the one-man Israel, who epitomizes Israel's suffering and becomes our quintessential superlative sacrifice. This sacrifice that sheds light on everything endued with atoning power in the Bible. In the Messianic Jewish Lab, we have a prayer activity where you'll be prayerfully reading through Isaiah 53 and Yeshua's death and resurrection account in Luke. I couldn't really decide which account was better to read in the four Besarot. So I chose Luke and put the other three in the expanded section for those diehards among you who really want to dig in. So here are the parallel accounts in Matthew, Mark, and John to take in the full picture. Now, if this is your first time reading these, you'll notice that there are different details that are shared in each account. It's a wonderful thing that we have 4 different eyewitness accounts passed down to us because each one highlights different parts of the story from different perspectives that create a very comprehensive and historically accurate description of this very complicated and confusing day for the disciples. They are different enough that we know they are not simply copies. And they sync together in such a beautiful way, just how we would imagine different people witnessing the same event from different vantage points, writing to different people, and it creates a remarkable ring of authenticity. Now, if you're interested in how the 4 resurrection accounts harmonize together, I have a document that I put together where I took a chart used by an anti-missionary, someone who was trying to disprove Yeshua's messiahship, and he put together this chart where he tried to come up with every possible discrepancy within the 4 accounts that he possibly could in order to discredit them. And so in this document, I review each one of these potential seeming contradictions and detail the different ways that they do indeed harmonize. And I think it's very compelling. I didn't put it in our unit formally because that kind of apologetics is just beyond the scope of what we're getting into in this class. But if you're interested in seeing that, just let me know and I will send it to you. Lastly, for our Bible readings, we are recommending the Tree of Life Bible to read through these texts. There are only a few Messianic Jewish translations into English. The Jewish New Testament by David Stern is a great resource. It uses a lot of Yiddish terms, which are great for some people, but hard for others to follow. The TLV, the Tree of Life version, is a newer translation done by a large committee of Messianic Jews, and we really appreciate it. The significant differences from Christian translations are that some of the Hebrew names, Yeshua, Messiah, Miriam, etc., are brought into Jewish space. And then the second is that the Hebrew Bible is organized according to the Tanakh, the Torah, writings, and the prophets, whereas a Christian Old Testament is organized more in a linear kind of a way. So the books are just in different orders, but they're the same books. Translations run from more literal to conceptual generally. So the NIV, the New International Version, for example, is a conceptual translation, making it accessible to modern readers. The paraphrase or the living translations would be an extreme version of this. The cons for something like that is that a translation that's more conceptual has more room for the translator's own theology to come in as they translate. And other versions are more literal, which the pro there is it's more literal to the text, but it doesn't always actually come out with what the text really is supposed to mean, and it can seem awkward at times. So anyway, it's fun to look at different translations and even the original language to really try to figure out the text. So the TLV is somewhere in between, and I really appreciate using this Bible. Now you can find the TLV translation on some Bible apps like Bible Gateway and Olive Tree Bible. I also put a link in the document here for their website if you'd like to purchase one. That said, if you don't have a TLV Bible and would like one, we would like to give you one as a gift. So just contact me and we'll get that sent out to you. Well, happy reading, and as always, don't hesitate to reach out to me with any questions, and we'll see you in our next video.